Hello, friends. Today, we are going to dive into one of the most beautiful, innocent, and deeply moving stories ever written, White Nights by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Whenever we hear the name Dostoevsky, our minds instantly jump to heavy philosophical torment, the dark labyrinths of the human psyche, murderers wrestling with their own conscience, saints wrestling with their own doubt. But White Nights is beautifully, achingly different. It is a short story, and yet it leaves an everlasting mark on your heart, the kind of mark that stays with you for the rest of your life, quietly, in the background, resurfacing every time you remember a moment of happiness that didn't last. This story unfolds against the backdrop of St. Petersburg, a city that experiences a strange and magical phenomenon during early summer, known as the White Nights.
During this season, the night sky never turns fully dark. Instead, a soft, dreamy twilight blankets the entire city until nearly sunrise. It feels as though a twilight zone has opened up right between night and day, a suspended world where neither darkness nor light truly wins. And the atmosphere of this story lives exactly inside that suspended world, a space where dreams and reality blur so deeply that it becomes almost impossible to tell them apart. This is the story of a man known to us only as the Dreamer. He is a profoundly lonely man who lives almost entirely within his own imagination, quietly detached from the real, breathing world around him. But real colour floods into his pale existence when he accidentally crosses paths with a young woman named Nastenka. For just 4 brief nights, he experiences what it feels like to have his entire dim, private universe illuminated by someone else's presence. But is this simply a love story? Absolutely not. This is a profound meditation on loneliness, on hope, on human vulnerability, and on the bittersweet, almost unbearable ache of heartbreak that nearly every person in love eventually has to face. Before we walk into the story itself, it's worth pausing for a moment to understand the man who wrote it, because White Nights was born from a very particular moment in Dostoevsky's life. He wrote this story in 1848, when he was only 26 years old. This was still early Dostoevsky, years before Siberia, years before the mock execution that would haunt him for the rest of his life, years before Crime and Punishment or the Brothers Karamazov would make him one of the most towering figures in world literature. In 1848, he was a young writer living in St. Petersburg, sensitive, idealistic, and, by his own admission, desperately lonely. He gave the story a subtitle that tells us almost everything we need to know: a sentimental story from the diary of a dreamer. Dostoevsky wasn't writing about some distant, invented character. In many ways, he was writing about a very real type of young man he saw everywhere in the intellectual circles of St. Petersburg. Educated, sensitive, full of grand inner thoughts, and yet completely unable to function in ordinary human relationships. Some biographers have even suggested that the dreamer carries traces of Dostoevsky himself at that age, a young man who spent more time inside books and daydreams than inside genuine friendships. Only a year after writing this tender little story,
Dostoevsky's life would be shattered. He was arrested for his involvement with a group of radical intellectuals, sentenced to death, marched before a firing squad, and then, at the very last possible second, had his sentence commuted to hard labor in Siberia. The man who returned from that ordeal years later was transformed forever, darker, more religious, more obsessed with suffering, guilt, and redemption.
This is exactly why White Nights feels so different from the Dostoevsky most readers know. It was written by a Dostoevsky who hadn't yet been broken by the world, a Dostoevsky who still believed, at least for the length of one story, that even a single moment of pure happiness might be enough to justify an entire lifetime of loneliness.
That belief, fragile as it is the emotional heartbeat of everything you're about to hear. It's also worth remembering that Dostoevsky wrote this story during a brief window when Russian literature itself was falling in love with a new kind of character, the so-called superfluous man, an educated, sensitive figure who feels everything deeply, but is somehow unable to act meaningfully in the world around him.
We see versions of this figure throughout 19th century Russian fiction, but Dostoevsky's dreamer is perhaps the gentlest, most sympathetic version of this type ever written. Where other authors might mock this kind of man for his passivity, or condemn him for his failure to engage with real life, Dostoevsky treats him with an almost tender compassion. He seems to understand, from the inside, exactly what it feels like to prefer the safety of imagination over the risk of
genuine connection, and he refuses to simply judge his own creation for that fear. Now, let's step into Dostoevsky's magical, aching world. Before we go any further, it helps to notice the very particular way Dostoevsky chooses to tell this story, because the structure itself is doing quiet, emotional work.
White Nights is written as a first-person diary, divided into 4 nights and a morning, as though the dreamer himself sat down afterward and recorded each encounter while the memory was still raw. This choice matters enormously. We are never given an outside, objective view of events. We are trapped, willingly, inside the dreamer's own perception of what happened, his hopes, his private interpretations, his quiet self-deceptions. When he misreads Nastenka's words as more than they are, we misread them right alongside him, because we have no other source of information. Dostoevsky is not simply telling us a sad story. He is making us feel, from the inside, exactly how easy it is for a lonely mind to build an entire world out of a handful of kind sentences. By the time reality intrudes and shatters that world, it doesn't just shatter for the dreamer, it shatters for us too, because we had been living inside his hope the entire time. Before we meet our 2 central characters, it helps to sit for a moment inside the atmosphere Dostoevsky is building. St. Petersburg, in this story, is not just a backdrop, it is almost a third character in its own right. This is a city of contrasts, grand imperial architecture standing beside narrow, shadowed alleys, wide open squares beside cramped rented rooms where clerks and dreamers and forgotten poets live out their quiet, invisible lives. And during these white nights, the entire city takes on a strange, dreamlike quality, as if the ordinary rules of time itself have been suspended. People walk the embankments at hours when any other city would be asleep, because the sky refuses to let the day fully end. It's the perfect setting for a story about two people who exist somewhere between illusion and reality, because the city itself seems to exist in exactly that same state: night without darkness, day without daylight. Our story begins on the quiet, half-empty streets of St. Petersburg, where a solitary man wanders through the pale summer night. Dostoevsky never once reveals the dreamer's real name, and this is not an oversight, it's a deliberate choice. He represents every single person who feels lonely, even inside a crowded room, someone who quietly cherishes the private world inside his own head, more than the harsh, indifferent world outside his window. We learn that the dreamer has lived in St. Petersburg for 8 long years, and in all that time, he has failed to make a single real acquaintance. He knows the buildings of the city more intimately than he knows any human being. He has personified the houses along his daily route. He greets a certain pink building like an old friend, worries when a house he's grown fond of gets a fresh coat of paint because it feels like a betrayal of its old character, and mourns quietly when a familiar structure is torn down, as if he had lost someone dear to him. This is how starved for connection the dreamer truly is. He pours all his need for relationship into bricks and mortar, because bricks and mortar, unlike people, never leave him. He spends his days locked away in his room, reading, staring out of his window, constructing entire imagined lives for himself in his head, lives filled with adventure, romance, glory, and companionship that he will never actually possess. In these fantasies, he is brave where he is timid, admired where he is invisible, loved where, in reality, he has never once been chosen. He imagines himself as a hero returning from some great journey, as a poet whose words move an entire nation, as a man surrounded by friends who would do anything for him. And then, inevitably, the fantasy ends. The room grows dark again, and he is simply a clerk of no particular importance, sitting alone with a candle burning low. This gap between the grandeur of his inner life and the smallness of his outer life is, in many ways, the true wound at the center of this story, long before Nastenka ever enters the picture. And then, when night falls and the bustling crowds finally fade from the streets, he steps outside to wander alone, talking quietly to himself, half living in the real St. Petersburg and half living in the fantastical kingdoms of his own mind. But on this particular night, something changes. As he walks near one of the city's canal embankments, close to a bridge, he notices a young woman standing alone at the railing. She is sobbing, quietly but unmistakably, into the pale twilight around her. The dreamer hesitates. He is not used to speaking to real people. His entire emotional life has been rehearsed only inside his imagination. But something about her distress moves him past his own fear, and gathering every ounce of courage he has, he approaches and gently asks if she's all right. That woman is Nastenka. She had been waiting for someone on that bridge, and when he failed to appear, fear and loneliness overwhelmed her. In that moment, a strange and unlikely rescuer arrives. Not a man of the world, not someone confident or charming, but this awkward, sincere dreamer, who simply wants to help. What follows is an intense, unguarded conversation between two strangers. The kind of conversation that sometimes only happens between people who know they'll likely never see each other again, and so feel free to be completely honest. Nastenka is touched by the dreamer's strange innocence, by how unlike other men he seems. But before they part for the night, she lays down a very clear, very deliberate condition. We will only be friends. No romance, no expectations. The dreamer agrees immediately and happily, and we, the audience, understand exactly why. For a man as starved of connection as he is, simply having one honest conversation with another human being feels like nothing short of a miracle. He would rather have friendship on her terms than nothing at all.
What's striking about this first meeting, if we look at it closely, is how completely it inverts the dreamer's usual relationship with the world. In every other part of his life, he is the passive one, watching the city from behind a window, admiring buildings instead of people, retreating into imagination rather than risking rejection. But here, for once, he acts. He notices someone in pain, and instead of turning away, as he might have on any other night, he crosses the distance between them. Dostoevsky seems to be suggesting something quietly important here, that even the most withdrawn, isolated person carries within them the capacity for real courage. It simply needs the right moment and the right person to draw it out.
Nastenka, without knowing it, has already changed him before their conversation has even properly begun. The next night, the dreamer arrives at their meeting place with an excitement he has never experienced before in his entire life. For the first time, he understands what it feels like to actually look forward to seeing someone, to count the hours, to rehearse what he might say, to feel that unfamiliar flutter of anticipation. This alone is a quiet tragedy hidden inside a happy moment. An entire lifetime has passed before this man ever felt something as ordinary as excitement to see a friend. Nastenka arrives, and tonight, it's her turn to open up. She tells the dreamer that she lives with her grandmother, who is blind and extraordinarily strict. Her grandmother keeps her on such an unbelievably tight leash that she would literally pin the hem of Nastenka's dress to her own clothing, so that Nastenka could never leave a room without her noticing. Nastenka's entire youth has unfolded inside this small, controlled, suffocating world. No friends, no outings, no freedom. Just the quiet ticking of an isolated household. That single detail, the pinned dress, tells us almost everything we need to know about the shape of Nastenka's life before this story even truly begins. It's such a small, domestic image, and yet it captures a much larger truth. A young woman literally, physically tethered to another person's control, unable to move even a few feet without permission. When we understand this, Nastenka's later desperation, her willingness to fall in love so quickly, her eagerness to trust an almost stranger with her heart, all of it becomes far more understandable. She isn't reckless or fickle. She is a person who has spent her entire life starved of freedom. And freedom, once tasted even briefly, is almost impossible to give up again. But everything shifted when a young, educated, refined lodger rented the upstairs room of their house. Slowly,
through shared books, borrowed novels, and quiet exchanges whenever the grandmother wasn't paying attention, Nastenka fell completely, hopelessly in love with him. He represented everything her sheltered life lacked: education, the wider world, the promise of an existence beyond four pinned walls. He would lend her novels through a small gap under a shared wall, and later invite her, along with her grandmother, to the theatre, one of the very few outings Nastenka had ever been permitted in her entire life. She describes those small kindnesses to the dreamer with such vivid detail that he can tell instantly how deeply and completely those brief moments had come to define her entire sense of happiness. For a girl raised inside four pinned walls, a single evening at the theatre, sitting beside a kind and clever man, was enough to reshape her whole understanding of what life could be. Eventually, the lodger's circumstances forced him to leave for Moscow to establish himself and find steady work. Before he left, he made her a promise. He would return in exactly 1 year, and when he did, he would marry her. Nastenka tells the dreamer that the year has now passed. The lodger is back in St. Petersburg. She knows this for certain, but he hasn't contacted her at all. Not a letter, not a visit, nothing. And so, every single night, she comes to stand on this same bridge, waiting in quiet agony, hoping he'll simply appear. Hearing all of this breaks the dreamer's heart in a very particular, very painful way. Because somewhere in the middle of these two nights, without either of them quite naming it, he has secretly fallen in love with her himself. And yet, like a genuinely good friend, he swallows his own pain completely. He doesn't manipulate the situation. He doesn't twist her words to make her doubt the lodger. Instead, he comforts her, reassures her, and gently tries to give her hope for the very relationship that stands directly between himself and any chance of happiness. It's one of the quietest, most selfless acts in the entire story, and Dostoevsky doesn't even draw attention to it. He simply lets it happen, trusting us to notice. On the third night, Nastenka arrives completely overwhelmed by despair. Her lover still hasn't come. Cracking under the weight of her own anxiety, she cries out, "Has he forgotten me? Was my love worth nothing to him at all?" The dreamer becomes her anchor. Together, they walk for a long time through the silent, sleeping streets, the pale sky glowing faintly above them. During this walk, in a moment of quiet intimacy, Nastenka turns to him and asks, "Have you ever been in love?" This walk itself deserves a moment of attention, because Dostoevsky uses it beautifully to show us two people moving through the same physical space while occupying two completely different emotional worlds. Nastenka walks beside the dreamer, physically, but her mind remains entirely with the man who isn't there. The dreamer walks beside her physically too, but his heart has already quietly wandered somewhere she hasn't given him permission to go. They are, in a sense, each other's companions and each other's strangers at the very same time, sharing the same streets, the same pale sky, the same silence, while carrying entirely separate griefs and hopes inside them. The dreamer answers, almost involuntarily, with something close to the truth. "I never was before, but I am living that feeling
right now. It's an extraordinary moment, one of the most quietly devastating confessions in all of Dostoevsky's writing. And Nastenka either fails to fully grasp the depth of what he's just told her, or she chooses, consciously or not, to overlook it, because her own grief leaves no room for anyone else's. This is one of the story's most painful ironies. The dreamer finally finds the courage to say something real, something from outside his own imagination for once, and the person he says it to is too consumed by her own heartbreak to receive it. And yet, as the pain of her situation grows more unbearable, something shifts in Nastenka too. She looks at the dreamer, at his patience, his unconditional loyalty, the strange, gentle steadiness he offers her when no one else will. And something in her softens. She looks into his eyes and says something that will completely upend the rest of the story. If he doesn't return, perhaps I will think of you. You are so good to me. These words detonate quietly inside the dreamer's chest. For a man who has spent 8 years believing that real happiness was something reserved for other people, this single sentence cracks open a door he never thought would open. Hope. Dangerous, fragile, desperately wanted hope begins to bloom inside him. And we, watching from the outside, already sense the storm this hope is walking toward. It's worth sitting with this moment a little longer because it captures something painfully true about the way loneliness distorts our judgment. The dreamer knows, somewhere underneath his excitement, that Nastenka's words were spoken out of grief, not out of genuine desire. He knows the sentence began with, "if he doesn't return," a condition, not a promise. And yet, he cannot help himself. 8 years of invisibility have left him so hungry for even the smallest possibility of love that he seizes on it anyway, building an entire imagined future out of a single conditional sentence. This is exactly the kind of self-deception Dostoevsky is so interested in throughout his career. The way the human heart, when starved long enough, will believe almost anything that promises to end the hunger. The fourth night marks the massive turning point of this entire tale. A cold wind moves through the city, mirroring the anxious storm building inside the dreamer's chest. Nastenka arrives, having made a decision. She has sent her lover one final letter. If he does not appear tonight, she will accept, once and for all, that it's truly over between them. Hours pass. The pale night deepens. Nobody comes. Heartbroken and exhausted, Nastenka finally breaks down and rests her head against the dreamer's shoulder. And then, in a moment neither of them could have predicted just days earlier, she takes his hand and tells him she is ready to leave her past behind entirely, to begin a new life with him instead. The dreamer is ecstatic in a way words can barely capture. 8 years of isolation, 8 years of being invisible to the world seem to dissolve in a single second. For the briefest moment, he is no longer a man who only lives inside his own head. He is a man with an actual future, standing beside an actual woman, under an actual sky. He even begins in his mind planning the smallest, most ordinary details of a shared life, where they might live, how he would introduce her to the few acquaintances he has, the quiet Sunday afternoons they might spend together. It is a future built in seconds, out of nothing but a single held hand. And that is precisely what makes its destruction, moments later, so unbearable. Smiling through the fading twilight, the two of them begin walking together, ready, it seems, to step into a new dawn. And then, suddenly, a voice cuts through the night behind them. Nastenka! It is him, her lover. He comes running toward them, his eyes filled with visible regret. In that single shouted name, everything the dreamer has spent the last few minutes building inside his imagination begins to crumble, even before he fully understands what is happening. There is a terrible, suspended half-second, the kind Dostoevsky is so skilled at capturing, where the dreamer must have known, somewhere beneath his shock, exactly how this moment would end, even as some small, stubborn part of him still hoped it might not.
The moment Nastenka sees him, everything changes in an instant. She lets go of the dreamer's hand, runs straight into her old lover's arms, and embraces him tightly, as though the last few nights had simply never happened. The dreamer stands frozen, rooted to the spot, as if the ground itself has been pulled out from under him. Every hope, every dream, every fragile future he had just allowed himself to imagine shatters like glass in a single fraction of a second. Before she disappears into the night with her lover, Nastenka turns back one final time, tears of gratitude, not love, but gratitude shining in her eyes. She says softly, "You are my dearest friend," and then walks away, hand in hand with the man she truly loves, leaving the dreamer utterly, completely alone, under the same pale sky that had briefly held so much promise. My friends, White Nights is not simply an unrequited love story. Underneath its gentle, dreamlike surface, Dostoevsky is quietly performing one of the most precise psychological dissections in all of his early work. The dreamer has spent his entire adult life constructing magnificent palaces inside his own mind. Imaginary triumphs, imaginary romances, imaginary versions of a life he never actually builds. But the moment reality delivers a genuine, sharp blow, that entire palace collapses instantly, because it was never built on anything solid to begin with. Dostoevsky seems to be warning us here. Dreaming is beautiful. Dreaming can even be necessary for survival in a cruel world. But a life built entirely on imagination, with no roots in real human connection, is a life standing on sand. It's worth noticing, too, that Dostoevsky doesn't ask us to abandon dreaming altogether, which would be a much simpler, harsher lesson. Instead, he seems to be drawing a much more delicate line between dreaming as a private refuge, which can sustain a person through difficult years, and dreaming as a complete substitute for actually living, which eventually leaves that same person unequipped for the real emotional risks that genuine connection demands. The dreamer's tragedy isn't that he imagines too much, it's that until Nastenka appears, he has never once tested those imaginings against the resistance of real life. When reality finally does intrude, it doesn't simply disappoint him, it overwhelms him completely, precisely because he has had no practice absorbing disappointment at all.
The story lays bare, with almost surgical precision, how prolonged isolation makes a human being both fragile and desperately, achingly affectionate. The dreamer doesn't fall in love with Nastenka because she is extraordinary or because their connection is unusually deep. He falls in love because he is starving for the most basic form of human attention, and she happens to be the first person in years to actually offer it to him. This is one of the quiet horrors buried inside this gentle story. Loneliness doesn't just make us sad, it makes us vulnerable to attaching ourselves fully to the first warmth we find, whether or not that warmth was ever meant to last. This is also, in its own way, a quiet warning about the dangers of prolonged isolation that feels remarkably relevant even today, nearly 2 centuries later. We live in an age where loneliness has almost become an epidemic of its own, where people can go days, sometimes weeks, without a single meaningful conversation, even while surrounded by more digital connection than any generation before them. The dreamer's condition, an intelligent, sensitive man slowly losing his capacity to relate to real people because he has substituted imagination for genuine relationship, feels less like a 19th century curiosity and more like a mirror held up to something many of us recognize in ourselves. And yet, here is where Dostoevsky elevates this story from tragedy into something closer to grace. Consider the purest definition of love hidden inside this ending. The dreamer could have reacted with bitterness. He could have argued, guilt-tripped her, tried to convince her to stay with him instead. Instead, he lets her go completely, without a single word of protest. Why? Because somewhere along these 4 nights, his love for Nastenka became larger than his need to be loved back. He genuinely places her happiness above his own desperate loneliness. Dostoevsky's message here is almost startlingly simple and startlingly mature for a 26-year-old writer. True love isn't about possession. It isn't about winning. It's about wanting the other person to be happy, even and especially when that happiness has nothing to do with you. It's worth pausing on the title itself, too. A white night, remember, is neither day nor night. It's a suspended, in-between state where darkness never fully arrives and light never fully triumphs either. This is exactly the emotional state the dreamer lives in for the entire story. He is never fully in reality and never fully lost in fantasy either. He exists in a fragile, glowing in-between space, just like the sky above him. And when the story ends, that in-between collapses. Reality, in the form of the returning lover, finally arrives, and the soft twilight the dreamer had been living inside is forced to give way to an ordinary, indifferent morning. There's a smaller, quieter symbol worth noticing too, the bridge itself, where all 4 nights of this story unfold. A bridge, by its very nature, is a place of crossing, a structure built to connect one side of something to another. And yet, for both of our characters, the bridge becomes not a place of arrival, but a place of waiting. Nastenka waits there for a lover who does not come. The dreamer waits there across 4 nights for a happiness that was never truly his to keep. Dostoevsky places his entire story on a threshold that is meant to lead somewhere, and instead uses it to show us 2 people who remain suspended, unable to fully cross into the lives they long for. Even the canal beneath the bridge,
still and dark, reflecting the pale sky above, mirrors this same idea of two surfaces existing side by side without ever quite touching. The world of dreams above, the world of reality below, and the characters caught somewhere in the thin reflection
between them. What makes White Nights even more fascinating is how clearly you can see, in hindsight, the seeds of everything Dostoevsky would later become as a writer. The dreamer's obsessive inner monologue, his tendency to live more vividly inside his own head than in the actual world around him, would return years later in a much darker and more corrosive form in the unnamed narrator of Notes from Underground, a man whose isolation curdles into bitterness and spite, rather than the gentle, forgiving sadness we see here. In many ways, the underground man is what the dreamer might have become had he never met Nastenka at all, or had this brief taste of human warmth never softened him. Even the theme of a single moment of transcendence justifying a lifetime of suffering, the idea that one instant of real, felt happiness might be worth an eternity of loneliness, reappears, transformed and deepened, in the spiritual struggles of characters like Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, and later still in the anguished, searching faith of the Karamazov brothers. What's remarkable is that this early, tender story already contains, in miniature, almost every major theme Dostoevsky would spend the rest of his life exploring. The danger of living too far inside one's own mind, the redemptive and destructive power of love, and the strange, almost paradoxical idea that suffering itself might be what makes a single moment of joy so unbearably precious. There's also something worth noticing about Nastenka herself, because it would be easy, on a surface reading, to paint her as the villain of this story, the woman who uses the dreamer's kindness and then discards him the moment her real love reappears. But Dostoevsky is far too careful a writer to let her off so easily into a simple role, and far too fair to condemn her either. Nastenka never lies to the dreamer. From the very first night, she is honest about her feelings, honest about the man she's waiting for, honest about the boundaries of their friendship. Her offer to build a life with him only comes in a moment of complete despair, when she genuinely believes her first love is lost to her forever. She is not cruel. She is simply human, reaching for comfort in the darkest moment of her life, the same way any of us might. When her old lover returns, her joy is real, and so, quietly, is her guilt, which is exactly why she writes to the dreamer years later, still carrying the memory of what he gave her. And this brings us to perhaps the most quietly radical idea in the entire story. We are conditioned, especially by modern storytelling, to expect that kindness should be rewarded, that if the good, patient, selfless character simply waits long enough, they will eventually get the girl, or the guy, or the happy ending they deserve. Dostoevsky refuses to give us that comfort. The dreamer does everything right. He is patient, he is honest, he is selfless to a fault, and he still loses her. Life, Dostoevsky seems to be telling us, does not operate on a system of moral rewards. Goodness does not guarantee happiness. And yet, the story does not end in despair, because the dreamer finds a different kind of victory. Not the victory of getting what he wanted, but the victory of having felt, however briefly, something real.
That distinction between happiness as an outcome and happiness as an experience, already lived and already treasured, might be the single most important idea Dostoevsky leaves us with. There's one final theme worth naming before we close: the strange relationship this story builds between time and memory. The entire tale takes place over only 4 nights, an almost absurdly short span of time to contain this much longing, hope, and heartbreak. And yet, by the end, we understand that these 4 nights will stretch across the dreamer's entire remaining life, replayed, treasured, returned to again and again in memory, long after the actual events have passed. Dostoevsky seems fascinated by this asymmetry, the way a brief moment, if it is felt intensely enough, can outweigh years of ordinary, uneventful time. The dreamer will likely live for decades after this story ends, and yet it's entirely possible that these 4 nights will remain the most vivid, most alive he ever feels. Happiness, Dostoevsky suggests, isn't measured by duration. It's measured by intensity, by how deeply a moment is felt while it lasts. In the epilogue of the story, years later, the dreamer receives a letter from Nastenka. She writes to him about her happy married life, thanking him warmly and gently asking for his forgiveness for the pain she once caused him. The dreamer reads the letter and smiles. There is no hatred in his heart, no bitterness, no resentment. He looks up at the sky and utters one of the most famous lines in all of literature. "My God, a whole minute of bliss. Is that not enough for a whole human life?" Even though his dream was shattered, those 4 nights gave him something he had never possessed before. A taste of what it truly means to be alive, to care deeply about another person, to love without asking for anything in return. And that memory, however brief, becomes the very light that carries him through the rest of his quiet, solitary days. It would be easy to read this ending as simply sad, a lonely man returning to his lonely room, his brief taste of happiness now nothing more than a memory. But Dostoevsky seems to want us to see something more hopeful buried inside that sadness. The dreamer at the end of this story is not the same man we met at the beginning. Before Nastenka, his happiness existed only inside fantasies he invented himself, untested, untried, never risked against the real world. After her, even in loss, he possesses something his imagination alone could never have given him. Proof, real and lived, that he is capable of loving someone other than himself and of being loved, however briefly, in return. That proof cannot be taken away from him, no matter how the story ends. In a strange way, his heartbreak becomes the very evidence that he is no longer only a dreamer. So friends, that was the journey of Dostoevsky's White Nights. Perhaps we all carry a white night of our own, somewhere inside us, a memory that stayed incomplete, or ended too soon, or never became what we hoped it would. And yet, somehow, it still leaves behind a gentle, nostalgic smile whenever we think of it. If this deep dive moved you, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your own thoughts and your own white nights in the comments below. I'll see you very soon with a new book, a new story, and a brand new journey. Thank you.